Because of the passage we're going to read in just a few minutes, I've been thinking about families a lot this week. Family and marriage and parenting and home relationships and other such things. So I've been reading about families this week. I read about the man named Robert Orban, for example, who said this. He said, "You remember the immortal words of Winston Churchill? We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight in the hills. We shall fight in the streets. We shall fight wherever." He said, I read that and I thought, sounds like my last family vacation. I've read about families this week. I read about the woman working at home, taking care of things at home when the phone rang. She jumped to catch the ringing of the phone, the ringing phone, and when she did, she tripped over a throw rug, lost her balance, and trying to steady herself, grabbed at the phone table, knocked it over, knocked the phone off, the receiver off the hook. When the table fell, it hit the dog, who leaped up, yelping and barking, which startled her 3-year-old son, who began to scream. She finally managed to grab the receiver and was about to say hello when she heard her husband's voice on the other end of the line. He was apparently talking to somebody he was with, and she heard him say, "Oh no, it's not the phone number. I'm sure that's my house." Chaos, fighting, difficulties, challenges. I've read about families this week. I even read about Maria Brunner. Maria Brunner and her family were chosen by the Times Online in the UK back in May of 2005 as the family of the week. Why were they chosen? Well, it seems like Maria's husband couldn't find employment, was out of a job, and so she was working hard, cleaning other people's houses to try to make a living, try to scrape enough together to keep them afloat. Well, her husband, the one who couldn't find a job, had enough time apparently to run up about $5,000 in traffic violations. Parking tickets, speeding tickets, you take your choice. He managed to hide it all from Maria for a while. But then finally, because the car was in her name, she found out. She didn't have $5,000 or anything like it. And so she was informed. You either will pay the $5,000 in fines or you will spend 3 months, 90 days in jail. I want you to listen to Maria's response to that, which I'm sure led to the reason why they chose hers as the family of the week. She said, "I've had enough of scraping out a living for the family. As long as I get food and a hot shower every day, I don't mind going to jail. I can finally get some rest and relaxation." The story then goes on to say, police reported that when they went to arrest Maria, she seemed really happy to see us and repeatedly thanked us for arresting her. While most people taken into custody hide their heads in shame, Maria, says the story, smiled and waved as she was driven off to jail. Enjoy. I know I will. And they chose hers as the family of the week. Family. We can't live with them. We can't live without them. We look for advice. We go to counseling. We read books to learn. And we even come to this book, trying to understand about family life. Now, I'm going to take a guess here. It's not a wild-eyed guess, but I'm going to take a guess that very few of you would disagree with this statement. It is in the family that the living of the Christian life is the most severely tested. I suppose if we ran up the flagpole, everybody would salute. That's the truth. Because we somehow know that it's in the family that our least appealing face is seen. It's in the family that they know us the best, that they know our struggles and our trials and our shortcomings. I think even the Apostle Paul knew that and knew it well. I think he knew it because of what happens in Colossians at the point where we are right now. You'll remember where we were last week. Last week we ended up with Paul talking about living the life of Christ and manifesting virtues in that life, virtues like compassion and kindness and grace and forgiveness and patience and love. Here's what's curious. He finishes talking about that and immediately turns to family life. It's almost as though Paul is writing that. He's writing about how we live out the virtues of the Christian life, and he's saying, okay, well, I want you to show patience and kindness and goodness and love. And by the way, speaking of family, his mind goes straight to the family because it appears that he realizes it is there that all those virtues will either be developed or be severely lacking. So it is that today we come to the household codes in Colossians. A few moments we're going to read them. But before we read them, some background. I'm going to take another guess. My guess is this. When we read what Paul has to say about families, your first reaction is going to be, whoa, that is nothing like my family life. Maybe the first thing that will strike you is the gulf that exists between families in Paul's world and families in our world. You'll notice they're very different. Paul will talk to 6 people, 6 roles that were present in the families of his day. Some of those are present in ours, some are not. And what he says to them are very different. He speaks to wives, to husbands, children, parents. He speaks to slaves and masters. All of those would have occupied a household in the day and in the time of Paul. And yet when we read that, first of all, who he's talking to, and then what he's saying to them, we're likely to pull back and say, very different from my family life. What in the world does that have to teach me in a world where family relationships were so dramatically different? Well, maybe some background would help. Some background in who it is that Paul is addressing and what life might have been like for them. So he's addressing 3 basic realities: marriage, parenting, and slavery. So a quote on each of those from a New Testament scholar might help us understand some of the background. So let's start first of all with a statement about family in general and wives in particular, drawn from the pen of New Testament scholar David Garland. Here's what Garland writes about what it was like in the world of Paul. He says, women did not usually receive any kind of formal education in Paul's day except in the domestic arts. Consequently, they were forced to rely on their husbands for a wide range of things. Patriarchal hierarchy was firmly entrenched. One ancient source defined the family as follows. In the strict legal sense we call a familia a number of people who are by birth or by law subjected to the potestas, the power of one man. Now think about what Garland is saying there. First of all, he's saying women, generally speaking, no education. Therefore, no options in the greater world. Therefore, totally dependent on that man called husband. But then he writes about family. Just think, we define family in a variety of different ways in our modern context. The way Garland says family was largely defined in the ancient world was this: a grouping of individuals who came together, who may not be related by blood ties, but who were all held together by one common reality. We are all indebted to and dependent upon that one man. The man in power. So that's a word of background about families, about wives. But secondly, also from David Garland, a word of background about fathers. Listen to what Garland writes about fathers. He says, the father had absolute control over the lives of his children, even after they were grown and married. Dionysius of Halicarnassus remarked, the lawgiver of the Romans gave virtually full power to the father over his son, whether he thought proper to imprison him, to scourge him, to put him in chains, and keep him at work in the fields, or to put him to death. And this, even though the son were engaged in public affairs, though he were numbered among the highest magistrates, and though he were celebrated for his zeal for the commonwealth. This power only ended when the father emancipated his son or he died. Total power. Absolute power over his progeny. Now, he writes there primarily about sons. I'll spare you some of the indignities, in fact, some of the tragedies of daughters. Far worse for daughters. A world where the father was absolutely in control. No wonder that some say about the ancient Roman world that in Rome, you were not a man until your father said you were, no matter what age you were. His word was law. And then the third one. Remember, he's talking about marriage, he's talking about parenting, and then thirdly, he talks about slavery. Now, this quote comes from New Testament scholar Klyne Snodgrass, dealing with the issue of slavery, which was quite different than what we think of when we hear that word and we think back just a couple of centuries in our past in the Western world to the horrible specter that was true here. Quite different in the ancient world. Listen to what Snodgrass writes. He says, in the Greco-Roman world, slavery was so much a part of life that hardly anyone thought about whether it might be illegitimate. Scholars are reluctant to hazard estimates about the numbers, but as many as 1/3 of the people in Greece and Rome were slaves. People became slaves through various avenues: birth, parental selling or abandonment, captivity in war, inability to pay debts, and voluntary attempts to better one's condition. Race was not a factor. In fact, probably the two most common avenues into slavery were, one, if your nation lost at war. If your nation lost at war, trouble lay ahead, because the likelihood of you becoming a slave was very, very high. Second avenue of the two probably most common avenues, imagine if this were true in modern day America, debt. If you had debt, overwhelming debt that you couldn't pay, you would end up in slavery. Now, those two avenues, accompanied with some others, must have been very broad avenues, because while Garland says not to hazard, or rather Snodgrass says not to hazard a guess, some scholars do guess. Some estimate that in the first century Roman world, there were as many as 60 million slaves. Now, what draws these together is that all of those would have occupied the household of Paul's day. The wives, the husbands, the children, the fathers, the slaves, the masters. And so when Paul writes about how to conduct our family affairs, he writes to all of those groups. Now, one more piece of background is in order, and that is this. Paul is walking a tightrope. He's walking a tightrope in what he's trying to do in the early Christian church. Because on the one hand, Christians are increasingly thought of as being bad for the society. Bad for the civil society, to be insurrectionists, people who are tearing apart the social fabric. You can understand a bit why that might have been thought. After all, Paul is inviting women into leadership in some of his churches. He is telling people that slaves and masters are equal. In fact, read Philemon. He's talking to Onesimus and Philemon. He's sending back the runaway slave, and he's saying, receive him back no longer as a slave, but as a brother. Women being elevated to leadership. Slaves being called brothers. In fact, in this very passage, last week's passage, in this very letter, you remember Paul's words. He says, here in the Christian church, there's neither Jew nor Greek. There's neither barbarian nor Scythian, nor slave nor free, because Christ belongs to all, and Christ is in all. Well, that kind of a message was not well received by the larger society. These are just a bunch of wild-eyed radicals intent on upsetting the social system. You can understand why they might have thought that. So Paul is careful. He recognizes the reality of his social context. At times, he even says, be really careful. When he writes to Titus, he writes to slaves in his letter to Titus and says to them, be sure your behavior is above reproach, so that the gospel of our God might be attractive. So he's trying to calm things down. That's part of his tightrope walk. But on the other hand, he stirs things up because he continues to press people forward to what it really means to be one, to be equal in Christ. He continues to pull forward into that society where there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. And we will see him do that in today's passage. So with all of that background, now we come to actually read what he says in Colossians 3. It's page 1756 in your pew Bible, Colossians chapter 3. We're going to read the household codes of Colossians. Read it with me, Colossians 3. I begin reading in verse 18. Wives, submit yourselves to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you and to curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. Those who do wrong will be repaid for their wrongs, and there is no favoritism. Masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you also have a master in heaven. What can we draw from that for our families in 21st century Southern California? The worlds are so different. There's a gulf between that world and this. We're reading a passage here where husbands are in control, wives are uneducated, where fathers have total power. The ancient world, Latin, patria potestas, the father's power, even life and death. Where children, regardless of the age, were to obey. We're reading about slavery and masters. What in the world can such a passage offer us in the modern world? Some decide it really can't offer us anything. In fact, the Revised Common Lectionary, a Bible reading and Bible preaching program followed by many Protestants as a way to take them all the way through the Scripture, actually leaves this passage and others like it out. Doesn't even deal with it. The gulf is just too great between then and now. And yet I would suggest to you that maybe there is something we can bring into our context from this passage. I would suggest, in fact, 3 simple take-home lessons from what Paul here says. The first take-home lesson, I would say, is this. In the Christian family, everyone has obligations. In the Christian family, everyone has obligations. You read it as we read that passage. Every single group that's mentioned, Paul has something to suggest, a directive to provide. Listen to the words of the well-known scholar William Barclay talking about this passage. He says, the Christian ethic is an ethic of mutual obligation. It is never an ethic on which all the duties are on one side. As Paul saw it, husbands have as great an obligation as wives. Parents have just as binding a duty as children. Masters have their responsibilities as much as slaves. This was an entirely new idea. Because in the world of Paul's day, if you were the father, if you were the husband, if you were the master, you didn't have obligations. That was obligations that other people had. Paul comes along and says, wait a minute, if you've named the name of Christ, if you belong to a family of Christ followers, everyone has obligations. What does that mean for us? You know what it means? It means, husband, when you come home from work, when I come home from work, when we enter the door of our house, our work is not over. Because in the Christian home, everyone has obligations. Housework is our work. That's the Christian family. Everyone has obligations. It means that in the Christian family, if the kiddos are sitting back, kicking back, feeling as though mom and dad are here to serve me, they're my maid, they're my butler, they take care of all my needs, I don't have to put anything into it. Paul would say, no, 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 no. Christian family, everybody has obligations. It means if I wait to do what I need to do, to be asked, to be told, to have someone standing over me, watching me, making sure that I do it, Paul would say, that's not the ethic of the Christian family. In the Christian family, everyone has obligations and everyone is willing to step forward and take initiative to do what is needed for the well-being of the whole family. That's a Christian family. A family where anyone sits back and waits to be served. May be a lot of things, but it's not a Christian family. Because in the Christian family, everyone has obligations. A second take-home lesson, I think, exists in this passage. Not only the reality that in the Christian family, everyone has obligations, but secondly, in the Christian family, there is a limit to power. There is a limit to power. That's, after all, what Paul is doing in this passage. You notice what he says. We tend to focus in on what he says to wives or children or slaves, but pay attention to what he says to husbands, fathers, masters. He is limiting, checking their power. In fact, we know, because some of them still exist, that it was normal in the household codes of the day when it came to detailing or to describing the duty of the husband to say, husband, rule your wife. Paul says something very different. Paul says, husband, and then he uses the verb form of maybe the best known Greek word of all to Christian people of Christian faith. He says, husbands, agapao, or in other words, agape your wives. The deepest, most other-centered, most self-sacrificing love in the New Testament. That's your responsibility, husband. Or if we were to go over to Ephesians, which is the parallel passage to this one, and in Ephesians, Paul teases out much more than he does in Colossians what he means in the household codes. In Ephesians, he begins the household codes with this statement: submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. He will go on to argue in Ephesians that every single person in the household is called upon to submit out of reverence for Christ. What's he saying? He's saying in the Christian family, there is a limit to power. What does he say to the fathers? He says, Father, no longer are you in absolute and utter control. No longer do you have the ability to take the attitude with your child. When I say jump, I mean you jump and say how high on the way up. No longer. Now he says, what I require of you as a Christ follower is that you not set impossibly high standards that will only serve to discourage your children. Don't do that. You will embitter them. Instead, be gentle, be gracious, be kind. What's Paul saying? He's saying in the Christian family, there is a limit to power. Why? Well, it comes out in what he says to masters. He says, I'll tell you why. Because you too have a master in heaven. In other words, God is watching. So be fair. There's a gulf between that world and this. But maybe there's a bridge over the gulf. Some take-home lessons for us in the Christian family. As we read this passage, we realize that everyone has obligations. In the Christian families, there is a limit to power. And then the third take-home lesson. In the Christian family, the vulnerable are protected. In the Christian family, the vulnerable are protected. That's what Paul is doing as he weaves that thought all the way through this passage. Those who are on the vulnerable end of the family's life, he's stepping up for them. He's speaking to those who have power. Yes, he's encouraging the vulnerable. He's saying, you don't get out of obligations. No one gets off scot-free. But the God who pays attention when the sparrow falls takes care of the vulnerable, even in the family. So be gentle. Be fair. Don't be harsh. What does that mean for us? What does that mean in our families? Well, there are vulnerable ones in every family. I don't know who is the vulnerable one in your family, but sometimes actually the state has to step in to protect them. If we lived by the ethic of Jesus, that would not be necessary. Because in our families, we would be taking care of the vulnerable, protecting them. I don't know who the vulnerable one is in your family. It may be that tiny, screaming baby. That baby who makes the adult frustrated and upset because the colic won't allow them to stop wailing. It's a vulnerable one. Paul says we protect the vulnerable. Maybe it's that teenager. That teenager who has a bent, a penchant for the darker side of life, with whom you want to strike out and be angry and be overly demanding. And yet somewhere down in that teenage heart is vulnerability. We seek to protect. Maybe the vulnerable one is a depressed brother, a clinically depressed sister who has struggled with life and for whom it seems like there's always a rain cloud overhead. And you've had to step in as a caring parent or a caring sibling to protect the vulnerable. Maybe the vulnerable one is an aging parent, no longer able to care for himself or herself. They frustrate you. They anger you at times. But in the Christian family, the vulnerable are protected. Paul speaks up for them in this passage. If we are following in his thinking, maybe that's what we are called upon to do as well. There's a gulf between his world and ours, between his families and ours. We live in a world where women educationally have the same opportunities, can attain the very same level, are able to self-determine. We live in a world where kids are told to grow up, to differentiate, to become their own authority. We live in a world where by the grace of God and the courage of others, slavery was outlawed long ago. We say it's so different in our world, but maybe not entirely so. Because maybe Paul has something to say. It strikes me that there are a couple of possible ways in which we could respond to this passage. We could look at this passage, read its words, consider its realities, and say, wow, that is not my world. Nothing like my family in 21st century Southern California. Close the Bible, look at our spouse, our friend, say, what's for lunch? What are we doing this afternoon? And walk away and wait for another passage that more fits us. That's one way. Or we could linger over the passage. We could listen to the ethic of Paul. We could realize that just as families hurt and struggled and had dysfunction in his world, so they do in ours. Maybe we can realize that maybe the best thing to do is to leave this place and to go home and take the initiative with our own obligations. Not wait for others to wait on us. Not wait for others to take the first step, but say, no, this is a Christian home, and in the Christian home, everyone has obligations. Maybe we can look at the passage and say, you know what? I'm always grasping, always grabbing, always trying to be the one in control, but in the Christian family, power is limited. So maybe I can go home and say, what's your opinion? What do you think? You make the call on this one. And maybe we can say, you know what? There is somebody in my family who's vulnerable, who needs care in a special way, love in an extra measure, support with extra strength. Maybe I can leave this place and go home and say, I want to care. I want to support. I want to do what I can to protect my vulnerable brother, sister, parent, or child. Maybe that's the attitude we could take. You know what? If we take that attitude, if that becomes our approach, then whatever else we're doing, we are at least doing this. We are living the family life of the common disciple who worships the cosmic Christ.